Yes, here we are, back again. And I can see Pankaj Mishra quite well this time, and I'm hoping that we won't have technical difficulties anymore, and we're very sorry about that. Like the collapse of the first part of our webinar. Technology is great, really, but it comes with a cost. When your connection is not good, then you're not there. It never happens in physical meetings. If you're there, you're there, unless you have a heart failure or anything like that. I mean, whatever. So good afternoon, and I really want to greet Pankaj Mishra again and welcome him to this IPC event that we are doing for the past year, ever since the pandemic started. And we basically started to discuss on the question of the Western model. I raised the question, maybe we can just start over. I can just ask the question again, and then you can respond. So welcome again.
Thank you.
So the question that I was asking is that in your books, you basically show us a remarkable continuity in the Western model in terms of its destructiveness, in terms of the modes of domination, and in terms of how it is pursued by the non-Westerners. Right? You sometimes take us back to the 19th century, 18th century, to the ideas, to the societies that are basically going through the experience of being Western, right? Or trying to catch up to the Western model. What I'm asking here is that, so okay, what is the difference today that we are experiencing? What are we experiencing? What happened to that model, to the Western model right now? Given that in the 19th century was the hegemonic model, everyone was trying to be Western in the non-Western world, all those modernizing elites and this and that, but now it's in a serious crisis, even within the West itself. What happened? It's a huge question, I know, but...
No, I think it's a very important question, especially now. Try and put it as succinctly as I possibly can. I think what has happened is that success has been exposed as deeply inadequate by existing reality today of the West. So just confining ourselves to the...
I think it's gone again, it's frozen. Pankaj, may I ask something? Maybe you can turn off your video and you can connect.
Okay, I'll do that.
Okay, this works better. I hope it works.
Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you quite clearly. Okay, so what I was saying is that I think today with the pandemic, what we're seeing is that a certain kind of rhetoric and discourse of the Western model as something we should all be aspiring to, whether it's democracy or successful economies, a cohesive society. Those were the ideals offered by Western nations, by Western Europe and America. I think now we are realizing that they were deeply contingent, historically contingent, those achievements and those triumphs. So we have to separate those claims made for the Western model from this reality that we are all now faced with, which is that the United States and Britain are struggling. They are in a very bad shape against the pandemic, and that it is countries that we never really much cared about, or if we thought about them, we thought of them as inferior, like China or South Korea or Vietnam, that have actually done much, much better than these powerful, rich countries. So that has reopened the question, like, what exactly is this particular achievement of the West? Why has it become so helpless suddenly today? And mind you, the pandemic is the latest event to expose that helplessness. I think various other things have happened, most prominently the election of Donald Trump, to raise a question mark against the Western model. But going back to the 19th century, I think what made the Western model so attractive, so seductive, was the fact of successful imperialism. The invasion, occupation, colonization of large parts of the world, including very large countries like India, Egypt, later in the 19th century, large parts of Africa, Latin America, Caribbean, East Asia, and even when countries were not occupied, they were bullied. Their sovereignty was radically impaired, like China and Japan. For people who confronted this kind of power, for them it was very clear that in order to survive, they had to basically duplicate the Western model within their own countries. So they had a particular idea of what they should be doing. I wrote about this in From the Ruins of Empire. Japan was the first, as it were, the student of the West, trying to build up a constitution, trying to build up a state. You see the same process in Turkey. That's what Ataturk in many ways is trying to do, saying we've been backward for far too long and now we need to imitate the successful Westerners. You see the same impulse at work in various post-colonial countries in the last several decades or so. None of us really stopped to reflect, especially in the last few decades, whether this model was politically sustainable, whether it was environmentally sustainable. And I think the answers are in that it's neither, that it is not environmentally sustainable. We've damaged the planet many, many times over in this great rush to acquire, to consume, to bring our living standards up to the level of a tiny Euro-American minority. And that if we go further down this route, then an extensive destruction of the environment is just going to be an everyday reality. We are already living with the consequences. Politically, it's unsustainable because it generates far too much inequality and discontent and disaffection. And in the end, it empowers a charlatan and a crazed figure like Trump right in the United States itself. We've been accustomed to crazy despots and autocrats in different other parts of the world, and we've been accustomed to pretty mediocre third-rate people as president of the United States, but we've never had a figure like Donald Trump. I think the fact that he's president today and still supported by a large number of people is a sign that this model is really deeply flawed, deeply, deeply defective. So I think what people outside of the West, or people who've been trying to catch up, as it were, people who feel left behind by the successful West, they are now being forced to recognize that what they were chasing in many ways is, first of all, quite elusive. It's not in your grasp. It's not something that you're close to achieving. And in the process of achieving it, you've created many problems locally, domestically. With far too many people unhappy with the way things are going, and they're going for far-right figures. They're going for demagogues. And then the other thing that has happened is now you know that you will never reach that goal. That goal is really unreachable. And furthermore, and that's the most devastating realization, that goal was never worth it. And I really think that is an extraordinary change, if we acknowledge it honestly. That's an extraordinary shift, because so much of our intellectual life, so much of our emotional lives, so much of our political processes, economic processes have been shaped by the hope that we will get there one day, and that we will also join this great party of the world. And now we're realizing that there never really was a great party. There was only a small party for a small number of people. And that also the party is over. You arrived too late. There's nothing there for you anymore to eat or to consume. I'm putting it very simply here, but we can.
Great. I mean, two immediate questions that come up to my mind. The first question is about, again, about this continuity between 19th century Western model and 20th century Western model, and the critiques we have to that model. I mean, if you go back to the 19th century, many critiques of the Western model exclusively focused on this aspect of the destructiveness of this model, or you could say Western model as capitalism, right? If you go back to Marx and all other critiques of the Western model, who are also insiders, who are coming from the West itself. But when you look at the critiques of the Western model today, what you see is it's almost always decoupled from a debate on capitalism and how capitalism is destroying, like the societies and our lives. I mean, I'm not saying that there are people out there criticizing the Western model from that perspective, but when you compare it to the 19th century, politically, intellectually, it's less and less. Do you think this critique, the role of the intellectuals or the lack of the ideas in that sense, is basically one of the things why we are experiencing this crisis right now, or one of the reasons?
That's a very important question, because I think we do find ourselves intellectually helpless in many ways, and the reasons for that are very much worth exploring. I feel that the critics, the early critics of the Western model of expansion, acquisition, appropriation, capitalism, imperialism, most specifically, were looking at this whole phenomena pretty holistically, and I think they were looking at just how unsustainable it was, not just politically, but also environmentally. Let's not forget that someone like Gandhi, for instance, very clearly saw that this model is not going to work for India on a very simple level. I mean, there's an exact quote of his, 300 million Indians, that was the population of India at the time, were to start consuming along these lines, the earth would be stripped bare. That's exactly what he said. So there was an awareness that this model is really not for us, and that, first of all, you can't go around conquering and occupying other countries, because there are no countries to occupy and conquer. Japan thought it had some countries to conquer and occupy, and it turned out that was an absolutely calamitous experiment in imperialism, which came to an end with nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So in the late 19th century and the early 20th, a very broad recognition that this model was really deeply, deeply problematic. It was built upon too much violence and too much dispossession. Today, the biggest opposition to the Western model is coming from far-right demagogues in various parts of Asia and Africa. And it's these people who are saying, we don't want the West, we are against the West, or it's coming from, really completely extremist militant groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, or, and, often they will not really go into substantive questions of what exactly is the Western model. Many of them are perfectly happy with the capitalist system as it exists. They're perfectly happy to make use of it and to enrich themselves and become. So what they're doing is they're critiquing, or their anti-Western critique has been instrumentalized. It's been turned into a rhetorical weapon. It's been used to project themselves as, sons of the soil, indigenous, proudly indigenous, authentically indigenous, very different from the westernized elites, and so on and so forth. So that, is one set of problems where honest critique of the Western model cannot really emerge. The other section of the population where it can emerge potentially, which is from the intellectual class, from the educated class, to which you and I belong. Now, one reason why it doesn't emerge in quite the same way is that the cultural and intellectual hegemony of the West is much greater than it was in the late 19th century. You have to remember that so many of these critics, early critics, people like Gandhi or Liang Qichao, and they were not coming from, Westernized backgrounds. They were coming from actually many cases, very traditional backgrounds, exposed to Western ideas and ideologies, often, learning, picking up Western languages. But at the same time, their experience was not confined to Western educational institutions or universities or think tanks or foundations. They were never part of those networks. Now, today, wherever you are as an intellectual, it's very, very rare that you're outside those networks, and the networks are essentially centered in the West. So Western ideologies of progress, Western ideologies of capitalism, Western ideologies, whatever is current in the West, if privatization is current in the West, deregulation is current in the West, at some point very soon, someone in India and Indonesia and Turkey will also start saying the same things. Why? It's because that person in these countries is also part of that network. At some point or other, they will go on a fellowship or a scholarship to a Western institution or a think tank or a foundation. They will go to universities where these things are taught, where these things have become orthodoxies. Especially in the field of economics, you feel that the ideological orthodoxies there are much, much stronger, very unchallenged, and also very pervasive. And the way they travel around the world is really quite extraordinary. And you also know, if you're intellectual wanting to make a living, that being a dissenter from those ideologies does not pay. It won't get you a livelihood. If you want to be a professional intellectual, then you have to become a mouthpiece for existing ideologies. You might, register your dissent here and there, but in the end, it really won't bring you the kind of, income or social status that you seek. And, many people obviously seek higher income and higher status for themselves. So I think the possibility of dissent or critique in the intellectual world has been foreclosed by these great opportunities, these great temptations to belong to something larger, to belong to these already existing networks. Really, I think we don't really think much about this problem, but I think it's one reason why we are really prevented until a big crisis like this hits, like the pandemic, into closely examining just exactly what we are propagating. We keep on mouthing these ideas that we picked up from, a Brookings Institution report or reading The Economist or Financial Times. We actually never really, want to examine just how practical this is, how much grounded in reality, whether this is really even applicable to our respective situations, whether you're in India or Indonesia, whether it's, just to give you a small example, whether it's really practicable to have India's large population, which is still engaged in agriculture, move to the big cities. Is urbanization, what does urbanization mean in a context like India? Is it really sustainable? The answer is actually been staring at us for a very long time. No, but still we keep talking about it as though we cannot stop. Why is it that we cannot stop? It's because there's no incentive to stop, There is simply no incentive to challenge that. So in that sense, intellectual life has become this big machine. It's a big industry. And it's really, in that sense, its output is, kind of more very homogeneous, not conducive at all to, fresh debates and fresh thinking. So I think, as writers, intellectuals, this is something we really need to seriously ponder. How can we create alternative sources of thinking and knowledge and sort of break away from these existing paradigms?
I see your point. I mean, and you're very correct to point out the shortcomings of the intellectual establishment, I would say, or the lack of ideas, the lack of alternatives to what we experience as the Western model right now. And the arguments that you have about the modernizing elites of the 19th century is kind of echoes this argument. I mean, it's in a different way. These elites were connected to the West, and you were saying that, okay, they were connected, but they still have the locality, but globalization of the ideas might have changed that. What I'm trying to say right now, or I really want to shift the conversation a little bit from the top-down modernizing or programs of these elites or to the Western model, to the models that became successful in the non-Western world. I mean, most recently, was it in the Age of Anger or maybe after that, or in some of your recent interviews, you basically said that, and correct me if I'm wrong, the developmental model in East Asia, that was your argument, your essay on COVID crisis, as I remember correctly again. And you basically hinted out the fact that, and with reference to the Indian experience and its comparison with the East Asian model, maybe it was not just this top-down agendas of the elites only, but maybe it was their failure, not being able to build a well-organized state, a productive agricultural economy, a strong industrial base, and educated citizenry. I mean, if it's what I'm trying to say is that maybe it's not the model itself, but maybe it's the way that we adopted the model, or maybe the corruption among these networks, or maybe the failure of the non-Western societies not to really to build up all these, institutional pieces of the strong state or strong society. So what would you say about that? Yeah. Is it really about the ideas, or is it about the failure to build a strong institutional base for these societies the reason that the crisis that we are living in?
Yeah. Well, there are several answers to that. The first essay I wrote about the breakdown of the Western model appeared 6 years ago. It was 2014 in The Guardian, where, and you remember at that time, there was no talk of crisis. Obama was president. We were all supposed to be progressing. Things were all working out. We had entered a post-racial age and so on. So my article was much criticized and attacked. And what I was arguing in that piece, essentially, was that this notion that you can modernize and achieve a degree of social stability and relatively high living standards, an efficient state, you can have it all and also have liberal democracy and human rights and all of those things. I was trying to point out that, first of all, that the historical evidence on which this model was supposedly based does not exist. The West, when it modernized, when it built up its industries, when it built up its military power, was not at all democratic. Most people didn't have the right to vote. Women didn't have the right to vote. I mean, so many people were disenfranchised. So England and the United States were not democracies when they embarked upon the project of nation building and industrialization and various other processes that made them so powerful. So it was absolutely absurd to expect nations that came much later to the process with far fewer resources, with far fewer advantages, to then also embrace liberal democracy and human rights, while at the same time creating efficient institutional structures and the state. And I was trying to say in that piece, the states that have a future and have a relatively better future than others are going to be countries with strong states. And that is something the pandemic has proved. So once you move away from a certain kind of moralizing language, which the Western model contains, is that, we're actually about Western values, we're about democracy. Once you separate that kind of rhetoric from the very violent, bloody processes of state building and institution building, then you will see a different reality altogether. So, if China has emerged from the pandemic and is restarting its economy, it's because it has such powerful and large state capacity that it can deal with the pandemic, it can cope with the after effects, the shocks of the pandemic, and then also restart its economy in double quick time. Countries that don't have those resources, that like India, that have boasted of their democratic credentials all this, find themselves completely helpless before it. At the same time, the processes of democracy, which once they're reduced to routine elections, just about determined political movement can hijack those processes, and that is also what has happened in India. So, in many ways, the whole Western model, whether it's talking about liberalism, whether it's talking about individualism, whether it's talking about democracy, is exposed as hollow at so many different levels. We don't really know what historical reality this rhetoric is based upon. If you're going to embark on the adventure of modernity, then it feels like what South Korea did or what China did, however violent and bloody, if that is what you want to do and what you succeed on, well, you build powerful states, you build strong state capacity, you create a system of social welfareism, you create public health structures, and you create a proper educational system, so citizens are properly educated. So this is where I think we need to examine all these ideas and assumptions that we've kind of inherited and then felt we can't really live up to these ideas. The problem is that nobody actually lived up to those ideas in the past. So why should the burden fall upon the sort of states and countries of the global South?
That's exactly the question that I was going to be asking to you. I mean, also there is one question from Professor Attila Eralp, which basically points out to that direction as well. He was asking whether the end of the Western model also means the end of capitalism or a specific form of capitalism and a rise of another form. And the rise of China and what the COVID crisis has shown us is basically hinting out to us, maybe to the fact that whether we are alone now with capitalism. This is the title of the book of Branko Milanovic. He said that now around the globe, capitalism is the only remaining model with only two variants. One is the liberal Western model that we're talking about, which is collapsing. And the other one is the political capitalism of China with strong state institutions, but with no liberties. Does this what we end up with? Are we really, like in between these two alternatives? And what would happen if all this liberal human rights aspects of the Western model is gone, or their appeal is gone? I mean, and we end up with this model. You could call it political capitalism or China's model that doesn't offer any type of normative.
Well, that is the tragedy of modern history that we have to recognize. That liberalism, individual rights, human dignity have been available to people at different points in the last 200 years, but those people tend to be very few in number and isolated, and there is no tradition of sustaining them over long periods, and that they're always besieged, those values and ideas. And even in very, very rich societies, you will find large numbers of people are being treated abominably. United States is a very good example. You have, after the war, a very rich society, but the condition of African Americans, how really sort of hard they had to struggle for even fundamental rights during the 50s and 60s, and afterwards, they were legally granted those rights, but how difficult it was to enjoy those rights in any substantive way. We know all that. So I think what we have to recognize that the ideals that were in a way upheld at the beginning of the modern era as the inheritance of all human beings, the so-called self-evident truths, have really only been realized by a minority. And that to make them available to a majority, we'll have to rethink our whole political and economic systems, because our political and economic systems have worked against more and more people realizing those ideas. And unless we make that recognition, I don't really know how we can move forward. So you end up with the capitalism of the Western style, which capitalism alone talks about, or you end up with the Chinese model, which doesn't really have much time for individual liberties, and neither of those models are appealing. Neither of those models are attractive. So it's genuinely an impasse, but it's not an unprecedented impasse. I think historically it's been very, very apparent that those values and those ideals have really been in a way realized by very, very small numbers of people.
To follow up on that, I mean, I'm going to be asking more about this question about the appeal of the Western model. So, for example, in my own work, I'm looking at the aspirations of the middle class non-Western citizens, and not just upper middle classes, but also lower middle classes as well. And if you look at the experiences of the refugees, and what you all see is that, I mean, they all want to be part of Western culture. I mean, many of them don't want to stay in where they are currently residing in. They want to migrate. They want to get a second passport, a citizenship in a Western country. And whenever you ask them what is appealing about the Western culture, what they basically refer right now is not the material conditions. And in fact, if these people move into any Western country, their material conditions probably is going to get worse, right? Yeah. They're going to get, downward class mobility, probably. Upper middle class Indian or upper class Turkish person is going to experience that, but they still want to move to a European country or get a citizenship from a Western country. And the thing is that they keep referring to the rule of law, not just the human rights, but a certain sort of stability, right? Yeah. But and this is not what they're experiencing in their own cultures, in the non-Western world. A lot of authoritarianism, democratic backsliding, instability, violence, different forms of violence. So what I'm asking is that, and this ideal is kind of democratized as well in the non-Western periphery. I mean, it's not just the top-down modernizing elites right now, but the masses, right? A lot of people really believe or I mean, they really believe in this appeal of the West in a sense, although they are criticizing the Western model. But when you look at their individual lives, you see a discrepancy in that. And this is even in the context of the crisis of the Western model, as I said. So what does this aspiration, this individual aspiration, tells us about the Western model? Or does it anything?
Actually, I mean, it's easy to generalize from that experience. There are any number of people from Myanmar, for instance, wanting to be in India. India is not a place where, you can say rule of law is flourishing right now. But actually, for them, it's much, much more preferable to what they have back in Myanmar, in a much, much worse state. I mean, you've always had people leaving their respective countries because it's absolutely intolerable for them, because they belong to the wrong ethnic minority and settle for lower living standards, inferior material circumstances in some other country where they feel safer, where they feel the
voice is gone. Can't hear you, unfortunately. I hope it comes back.
Oh, I can hear you.
Now I can hear you. Please go on.
I can hear you. Yeah. So no, what I was saying was that there has always, been many, many examples in history of people leaving in intolerable conditions, move to places where they feel better protected. I don't think the West is unique in this respect. I mean, also it's also true that post 45. Europe in particular, Western Europe in particular, rebuilt itself and achieved a society and rule of law that was much, much stronger than what had gone before it. and it was partly in reaction to what had gone before it, which was, a complete hell. Europe was in complete hell for most of the early 20th century, and after that, it actually created a better society, a society generally, where rule of law was respected. And I think, obviously, it would be attractive to many people who feel the absence of it elsewhere. But, I don't really know whether that in itself proves that the Western model is sustainable, or the Western model can be copied in its entirety in some other political or economic context. It's, again, historically contingent. There was that moment where Europe rebuilt itself, emerging from the ruins of two destructive wars, and created a society that was, hospitable, briefly at least, to people from different parts of the world. And even we know that there were problems, and was not that hospitable either to many of these people. So these are all, I think these are all dependent on certain sort of circumstances. I really don't know whether we can sort of generalize broadly on the basis of those examples.
But, I mean, could it be showing the fact that for many of these people, be it like modernizing individuals in their own countries, it's related to the loss of hope? Maybe it's basically that the fact that this country is not gonna go anywhere from now on, so I have to find, or the fact that, the copying itself is not gonna work here. There is no hope, so maybe I should just find hope from there, which takes me to this feeling of, or the power, not a feeling, but the power of emotions that you talk a lot, right? Specifically in The Age of Anger and in your last book. And the fact that the anger, resentment, loss of hope, the fear that everything is gonna fear from, like failure or fear from future, plays a lot of role in contemporary politics. Was it always like that, or is it a new phenomenon? I mean, what role emotions really play in today's world, or our perceptions about the world, our feelings about the world, our experience in this world? What role do they play?
I think more and more they play a bigger role in the sense that, for individuals today, their degree of exposure to the outside world is much, much greater than it was before. I can see it in my own parents, and indeed my grandparents. The level of awareness about the world at large, especially my grandparents, was very limited. It was limited to, essentially a few hundred.
Can't hear you.
Sometimes a day happening.
Oh, now you're back.
Okay.
But
so
it was two sentences.
Okay.
My parents, and then it just.
Yeah, my grandparents. I was saying, their level of awareness was relatively low. What they were aware of, what was happening around them, a few hundred square miles, and they would read the newspapers, which would arrive 1 or 2 days late. So they would come to know about what is happening in different parts of the country, and maybe some news about the world at large. But their lives were conducted on a pretty, kind of grounded way. The people they were talking to were all face-to-face encounters. So there was a degree of control that came from that's very, being in a very limited world. That this is a world that and that you can somehow manage. You can kind of deal with it. Now, when I think social relations become abstract, and that is what has happened very, very dramatically over the last few decades or so, where you suddenly find yourself alone in this new area, new realm called the global, and have no buffers at all. Previously it was the family, it was a community, it was the neighborhood, it was the city, it was a village, it was the local, state government, it was the national government. There were all these different levels of buffers which negotiated your relationship with the so-called global. Now, because of the way in which we process information, we receive information, in the way we think of the world as something, full of opaque processes, our whole relationship with that realm has changed. So we are far more exposed, and as a result, there is much, much greater pressure on our minds and souls, and much, much more emotional intensity at the same time. I think, we are far more troubled, we are far more assaulted by news of the outside world, by uncertainty, by confusion. And I think that is taking a tremendous toll on people's lives and their emotional lives and inner lives. And I feel like this is really a very underexplored subject. Of course, psychologists know about this; they talk about it. Psychoanalysts, people who deal directly with people who are affected by this phenomena. But I don't think it features much in our general discourse. Just how much pressure we are placing on people's brains, their souls, how much we are wanting them to absorb. Sometimes it feels like there's just too much stuff out there for a single human being to absorb and process, and then come to a state of satisfaction about his or her life. That seems more and more impossible. So emotions have come to play a really large role. Emotions in the past were triggered or provoked by your face-to-face interactions, whether with your wife or your father or your mother, with your sister, with your siblings, with your other relatives or with your friends. Now you're being triggered by something someone says, millions of miles away in the United States on Twitter, social media. The way in which you're being stimulated and of course manipulated all the time, they are potentially just innumerable.
Okay, so we are basically talking about our desire for more control in our lives that has increased tremendously because we have more information about the world, what our options are. But at the same time, our capacity to control what is around us, including our bonds, has decreased tremendously as well. So we have more desire to control and less capacity to control. So there's a gap in between. That's
Absolutely
what I'm hearing.
Absolutely right. Yeah.
So that gap seems to me is filled by what you call charlatans or authoritarians or populists.
Yeah.
We're basically, and I mean, I'm asking you this, we're basically really creating new emotional bonds with their supporters in new ways. And they are, and again, I'm asking this, whether they are really transferring this individual discontent or frustration with the world to something bigger now. Like if you look at the foreign policies of India, Turkey, even to the United States, making the nation great again, or this rising states, so it's sort of really filling in this capacity gap that the individuals actually experiencing in their lives. Would that be correct to say that it's basically?
Absolutely. I mean, I would even say that that is very true for supposedly advanced democracy like Britain, where the slogan "Take Back Control" was the most successful slogan of the Brexit campaign. Nobody really knew what it meant, in terms of just how entangled the United Kingdom is with the arrangements of the European Union. Very few people had a very precise idea what exactly that we are going to be taking back control of. But the idea, the slogan was emotionally very, very attractive, very seductive. I mean, people say it won the campaign for Brexit in many ways. That is what people were feeling. They completely lacked, increasingly lacked this sort of control. And here comes a demagogue offering them that control, and they fell for it. I mean, of course, you see that a phenomena in different ways in places like India and Turkey, where things seem so opaque to so many people. They find it very difficult to understand what's going on in the wider world. And along comes someone who, is offering them new forms of understanding, is offering them new kinds of emotional bonds, new ways of coming together, of feeling you're part of a group. You can be united around hatred. I mean, that's very important. Demagogues. You can create communities of hatred, identify the enemy and unleash the so-called people after them. This is now, a very well honed tactic, including in the United States. That's what Trump is doing right now as we speak. So I think the psycho-political processes whereby social bonds deteriorate, emotional confusion arises, and then along come the simplifiers, people who offer you new community, new sources of meaning, new sources of emotional satisfaction. And, you find that there is actually a very large population of people who are ready to follow you. And that is, I think, really underpins the successes of many of these demagogues today.
I have a question on that as well. I mean, what comes up to my mind is that the loss of control, as you show in The Age of Anger, usually expressed through anger, right? And you basically end up with the masses who are angry against everything that comes in their way. What I'm asking is slightly different, but also connects us what's happening in global politics and the rise of populism or some other phenomena that you can explain maybe with that. Is age a masculine? Is anger a masculine feeling basically, or is a crisis of masculinity as well?
Yeah, I think most extreme expressions, definitely, of anger that we see today can be sourced back to men. It's mostly men who are out there trolling on social media, embracing arms like the right-wing militiamen that you now see in the United States. I don't have seen a single woman amongst these folks holding a machine gun or one of those horrible weapons. So a large part of the crisis today is the crisis of the young male. It's not even middle-aged males so much, or older males. I think it's a lot of young men, and in sort of seeking the kind of power that is promised to them by the modern world, whether it comes through a stable job, whether it comes through building a better body, whether it comes through sporting excellence. I mean, these are all masculine models of achievement in many ways. And at the same time, they are very elusive, most of them. In fact, the most achievable model is actually a better body, which you can actually build on, by going to the local gym. Everything else seems too difficult to achieve. One reason why in places like India, you've had this explosion of bodybuilding is because that seems like one realizable goal of masculinity that you can every day work on, and actually at the end of a few months or so, you can have a body that you can boast of. Everything else has become much more difficult to achieve, and a lot of anger and disaffection results from that failure. And often it's directed against weaker peoples, physically weaker peoples, people below you in the caste system or in the class system, or so-called liberal elites, cosmopolitan elites, rootless folks, all those descriptions, all those phrases that they have for people who are already privileged or who seem already privileged. So I think in many ways, many men across the world today are suffering from essentially the failure of realizing these masculine, hyper-masculine ideals. And again, I think the right response would be to withdraw and to actually examine those masculine ideals. Just what exactly is the kind of power that we are aspiring to? Whether this is actually something indistinguishable from the power to dominate, the will to dominate. Is this really a power that can be wielded benignly with outcomes that are good for other people as well, or whether it's just all about self-aggrandizement? So I think you're right. I mean, I think I myself written and spoken about this, that in many ways what we're experiencing is a crisis of masculinity. One reason why people like Erdogan or Modi, Putin, you look at their public personas and the investment they make in presenting themselves as strong men,
and maybe even the challenge to the Western modernity, and the radical challenges coming from ISIS, for example, it is an extreme form of, it's a hyper masculinity, right? No.
Yeah. And at the same time, you have movements within the West for kind of that hyper masculinity, ranging from Jordan Peterson type cults to far right militiamen, Trump himself. So it is that search for a power of some kind, which will make you distinctive, which will essentially make you unassailable, and it's a completely a fantastical quest, because in a way you're trying to chase an illusion, because that power slips away from you. That's the nature of power. The moment you feel you're close to it, it slips away, and then you start chasing it more and more, at the same time becoming vulnerable to fantasies like Donald Trump and Erdogan and Modi, who are preying on your insecurities, who are preying on your deep emotional inadequacies, and offering themselves as surrogate fathers and models of the strong men that so many men want to be today.
On that note, we were discussing about this during the lunch we had today. You were telling that the need for dropping the fantasy, right? Even when you're looking at the liberal international order, Western model, human rights, however you name it, what the West needs to do is to drop the fantasy of this being liberalizing, democratizing power, and face the reality. And in a sense, you're urging the West to grow up, right? What I'm asking here is that what happened after COVID and during the COVID crisis, and also movements like Lives Matter, right? Are these self-reflexive moments? Is it possible that we're going to experience a self-reflexive moment within the West, or are we already experiencing a self-reflexive?
Definitely. I think there's already a quality of reflection, a quality of analysis in the Western press, at least, that you didn't really see just 3, 4, 5 years ago. So things are changing. Things are not changing fast enough because the big demographic shift hasn't happened. I think people who are still in positions of power and influence in the intellectual world are still people of an older generation. They're not making space for younger people or younger generations. And I feel like it's the younger generation that is really going to advance this process of reflection and criticism and take it further, because they have grown up with no illusions. They have grown up with no fantasies. If you grow up in a world where George W. Bush is president and the financial crisis happens and Donald Trump gets elected, you have no illusions, really. We've seen reality up close. The illusions have belonged to a previous generation that grew up, at a time when things were stable, America seemed powerful, It seemed like without any challenges whatsoever. If you grew up in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and if you belonged to a privileged class, you went to a good university, had a good education, then had a good career, you felt like this was, how the rest of the world was also proceeding. Globalization was working out. Everyone was embracing American-style capitalism. They were deregulating, privatizing in India, in Turkey, and Russia. Those were the kind of things you grew up with. It's very difficult to get rid of them at this point, at this late stage in your careers, if you're in your late 40s, 50s, 60s. So you are surrounded by illusions, and it's very difficult to let go of those illusions. Whereas young people did not have those illusions in the first place, so they are saved this huge bother, this huge task of destroying your own illusions, which never really is accomplished, because how can we live without illusions? So I feel like there is more hope from a younger generation which is embarked upon this process of criticism, and I really think criticism is the most important thing we can do as thinkers. I feel like criticism is a very underrated feature of modernity. What was the project of modernity? The project of modernity was to stop ancestor worship of all kinds. To stop believing in the authority of, the monarch or the church or some other religious figure of authority. And you were meant to employ your own intelligence, your own reason, and to criticize the existing arrangements. Somehow, we've kind of lost sight of this essential idea of modernity. That actually modernity is about criticism, and it's about, in a way, using criticism to create new things. And in a way, what the younger people are now engaged upon, sometimes with great anger and frustration, is this act of criticism. It's like, let's take this further. Let's kind of break away from old fictions and old fantasies and old illusions, and look at reality as it exists today. The fact that a white police officer can murder a black person in broad daylight, and not much will happen to him. That right-wing militiamen can assault peaceful protesters who are protesting against racism, and the US president will sign off on that. He will even encourage them to attack those protesters. So how did we arrive at this world? When you start asking those questions, I don't think, speaking about liberal democracy or pluralism or Western values is going to be much help there. What would be much more useful is if you look at institutional racism within the police force in the United States, if you look at mass incarceration, if you look at the justice system, how it has, dealt with issues of a racial nature over the decades, those would be much more useful. So, moving away from normative claims or moralizing of a certain kind, and actually looking at things as they actually exist, that is what most of these people are doing, and I think that's a very, very positive step forward. I mean, I can tell you in my own lifetime, writing and publishing and thinking, there's never been a more hopeful time, even though we are in a really bleak situation right now. But I think intellectually we have broken new ground, no question about that, just in the last few years. And I think Trump has been a big catalyst. So in a perverse way, Trump is to be credited for unleashing a new way of thinking about so many different issues, which, if someone like Obama had been around much longer, that reckoning would have been postponed. We would have still consoled ourselves with this notion that we have a black president, the post-racial age has arrived. Now it's very clear that it was completely untrue, that idea, completely untrue. And now we know that it was untrue. How much longer did we want to live with that illusion? Let's be glad that it ended when it did, and now we can actually look at reality in the face.
Okay, the one last question for me. There are several questions from our audience. The question that I have is exactly this. We are sort of, as we talk, dropping the fantasy, and through Trump or through other authoritarian leaders, they're sort of exposing the hypocrisy of the system, and that wouldn't have happened if Obama was the president, and still is the president. But the question that I have in my mind is the fact that we basically, it also unleashed a lot of anger that we have, right? Without a certain lack of organizing ideas about the future. So we have right now, as you said, in the last 2 years, a lot of critique about the institutional racism, hypermasculinity, authoritarianism, a lot of intellectual debate around this. But it seems to me that, and I'm asking your opinion, we don't have a lot of positive models on how to organize the future. I mean, the critiques of the modernity right now is not really providing that utopian answer, or what you would say. I would say lack of utopia that we're experiencing, maybe, about the future.
Yeah, I don't think that's a huge disadvantage, because every generation should really create the world for itself. Every generation inherits the world, and then it has to struggle with the world and to try and make it a better place for their children and for their grandchildren. And I think what's important is to really properly engage, and not worry so much about, do we have a model to work with? And some people, out of despair and frustration, start invoking some fantasy of the past. It's like, oh, that was better, let's go back to it, let's restore. I'm sure the temptation will be very strong when Joe Biden wins, is that let's just go back to where we were with Obama. Let's bring back those people, bring back those sentiments and those ideas. But it'll be another kind of fantasy, really, which won't take us anywhere. I think what's important is that we have actually made pretty good progress just in the last few years, and it has come about not because intellectuals have sat in their webinars or their seminar rooms or their think tanks or foundations and thought up new ideas about how to organize the future, but because young people have entered politics, they've engaged with the world that they live in, and they have come up with new ideas. A very good example is the Green New Deal. I think I mentioned it yesterday. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, another young Congress person, has come up with, and how quickly it took traction, how quickly it became widely accepted, often debated, but also respected idea, something to work with as we go forward, to the point where Joe Biden really can't ignore it completely. He has to, when he becomes president, he has to take that on board. So what I'm trying to say is that these ideas for how we organize our societies can really only come from political struggles. And I think we might not depend too much on, probably is wise not to depend on the intellectual system as it currently exists, because the intellectual system right now, certainly has been too interested in self-perpetuation and self-protection, and I think that habit needs to be broken. I think intellectuals need to be brought back into a closer dialogue with society, and people who people who comprise that society, and break away from their links with, especially in the case of the United States, with politicians, with big businessmen, corporates, and actually sort of test their ideas against reality, and specific realities, not just this idea is going to be universally applicable, in various different national, regional contexts. So yeah, I think there is definitely hope there in the way young people particularly are engaging with their very, very difficult present right now. And I think it's out of that engagement ideas for the future will emerge.
Great. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful conversation. Now, I would like to turn to the audience. There are some interesting questions that the audience has raised. Let me start with Muhsin Yanar's question on posthumanism. The question is, do you think that posthumanism has contributed to the end of the Western model? And in a way, maybe his question could be framed in a way that whether the end of the Western model is related to the structural changes in the way that capitalism operates.
That's definitely, true in that capitalism broke free of the kind of national boundaries it was still, operating in during the heyday of the welfare state back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And once it became truly global after the 90s and in the 90s, during the 90s, that was a very hectic period. It sort of basically, again, I think the fact that people could outsource jobs as easily as they did, where they could make their most profitable investments in China and other parts of the world, and actually, essentially deprive many areas in the United States of needed investments. When all that became possible, and it started to become possible in the 1980s onwards, then of course the Western model in which democracy and capitalism went together, that began to fall apart, where democracy and capitalism became antagonists. And that capitalism started on a different path altogether, where it was no respecter of national democracies, of democracy within a nation state. It became, in fact, an enemy of that, basically violating its ideals of equality and dignity and integrity. The fact that so many of these corporations became so powerful that nation states lost power, lost the capacity to actually keep them in check. And these people started to sort of basically, steal on tax. They might say they were legally avoiding tax, but we know from these tax havens and various other rackets that they've indulged in, that they were essentially not paying to national governments what they were supposed to pay and had paid in the past. So with all this that happened with deregulation in the 1980s, yes, I think the Western model itself came under tremendous pressure from within, because its success really rested on democracy and capitalism being on some kind of a working relationship. And when that relationship broke, then it became very difficult to sustain it and to hold it up for as a model for the rest of the world.
Okay, I was going to ask something, but I thought I really already asked many questions. So if we have time, I'm going to be asking a question related to that. But let me again ask one of the questions of the audience. Peter Verstrate is asking this question, and he says that how can one go beyond or even without the discursive circuits of the knowledge industry as you describe? Is it really a desire to be part of it, or aren't we in a relation of interdependency? Is a self-critical stance then enough to overcome that interdependency, or is it a structural institutional thing, in a structural institutional breakdown is necessary rather than an individual self-reflexivity, maybe he's asking?
Yeah, maybe all of those things, I really have no ideas about how to solve this problem, but I think it is actually genuinely a problem, and it should be recognized widely as such, that our intellectual discourse is homogenized to the point where it's very, very, sterile, really very extremely sterile. If you look at the intellectual output of, some of the mainstream publications, periodicals, or the think tanks and foundations that are churning out papers and it's just very, very disappointing, and it has very little to say, about contemporary realities, because it's been working with concepts and ideas derived from, some idealized past. We talked about that earlier. So it's find itself really struggling to understand what's going on, and you see the evidence of that struggle in the op-eds in the New York Times and the FT, and the Economist, really, really floundering. How does one change that? Really, I mean, I think setting up alternative institutions might replicate the same problem. The creating special spaces for dissent might also mean marginalizing them or condemn them to marginality. But really, I mean, I feel like the role of the free thinker or the role of the unaffiliated thinker ought to be cherished, praised, respected a lot more. I feel like we pay little heed to the figure who's not actually working within an institutional setup, within institutional networks, and this prejudice exists in different directions. I often argue that people from countries that were colonized by the West offered some of the most interesting critiques of Western arrangements, of the so-called Western model. But why do we not pay much attention to them? Why do we keep talking about what Marx said, or what Adorno said, or what Hannah Arendt said? It's because Hannah Arendt and Adorno all worked within institutional structures, and they produced books, they produced scholarship, ideas that can be easily categorized, put in certain academic disciplines, and then studied. They can, the sort of bibliographies can be generated out of the works that have been done on these people, and so on and so forth. So there's a whole infrastructure there supporting and advancing their claims as major thinkers. There is no such infrastructure supporting, say, a writer in China in the 1920s and 30s, who also offered some very penetrating thoughts about the nature of totalitarianism, about the nature of Western democracy. So we don't pay them any attention because they haven't actually written the kind of prose, they haven't published with Cambridge University Press. You know what I mean? It's that there are built-in prejudices preventing us from actually, seeking out alternative sources of ideas and knowledge and wisdom. So that is also, I think, we need to keep doing more of. In India and in other places in Asia, I've often found that people who are working on the ground with NGOs, or not with NGOs, even with organizations like the World Bank and so on, tell me something far more interesting than what I will get from reading a think tank report, or reading The Economist, or reading the Brookings Institute, or New America, or any of these foundation reports. So I feel like we need to actually reach out to some of these people who are actually working on the ground, whether it's environmental groups or people fighting mining corporations in India. People actually engaged in struggles who are not recognized as intellectuals or thinkers, but they have far more interesting things to say about what they are doing and also the world at large.
Great. I have two questions about Tanpınar from Alper Zafer and also from Ayşe Kadıoğlu. Let me read them. Alper Zafer initially posted this question only to me, but then he posted it here. And the question is, your intro to the Time Regulation Institute, also on The Guardian, has been criticized for misplacing facts and misrepresenting the author. The shift to the Western times started with the Ottomans. Or Tanpınar is known to express his appreciation to some Kemalist policies as well. What was your reading on Tanpınar based on? The English translations of his novels, including A Minded Piece, or other Turkish novelists such as Pamuk, or the Western model as a descriptive tool. And Ayşe Kadıoğlu asks, in an attempt to reveal your fascination with Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar, I would like to ask what, in your opinion, are the damages caused by top-down modernization? What are the political impacts of coming to grip with such damages? So basically 2 questions about Tanpınar, but on different directions, I would say.
I must confess that I'm no authority on Tanpınar. Obviously, lacking any knowledge of Turkish, I can only rely upon English translations of what exists on Tanpınar, and I'm very happy, in fact, delighted to be corrected on any mistakes I have made, and happy to correct them in future editions. This is when you write introductions to writers. I've written introductions to all kinds of people, E.M. Forster, Kipling, or Naipaul. You are obviously not aware of every single fact in their personal biography or in their kind of larger historical context, and often you make mistakes, and you are. I'm always very, very happy to be corrected. I think he was not the only writer at that point talking about this project of top-down modernization and the uprooting that happens as a result of that. There were also other writers elsewhere in Asia who were doing that. Of course, Turkey came relatively early to that process, but let's not forget it also happened first in Japan, and the first generation of modern Japanese writers, Suzuki. I mean, there were others who also dealt with this phenomenon of their lives, of certain ways of being, certain worldviews, abruptly being declared backward, and something that had to be discarded to make way for more modern outlook and more modern infrastructure. So this sort of dwelling on loss and deliberate destruction often of the past is a recurrent theme in much of fiction in Japan and of course later in places like India too.
Okay, one last question from the audience. If you have questions, please post them now. And I'm going to be reading Jana Tulush's question on digital authoritarianism. The question is, so she asks, the recent Freedom House report shows that the pandemic threatens the state of democracy and human rights more. The report warns these authoritarian moves of the governments will stay even we recover from the COVID-19 crisis, and people living in those countries will suffer longer. What do you think about enhanced tech surveillance and much more control in the hands of the national governments?
Well, that's always, a danger. In fact, in March, when we started to realize that, this is a very, very serious pandemic, I wrote a piece about, just how the state is going to become hugely important again. And one consequence of that would, of course, can be beneficial, which is that the state is the only agency able of coordinating an effective response to the pandemic. You can't just leave it to market. You can't leave it to individuals to organize, or even to private corporations to organize a response to the pandemic. It's only really the state that can do that. But at the same time, in reinvesting so much faith and trust in the state's capacity might backfire, because the state, especially the state when it's run by autocrats, is always interested in accumulating more power. And it will acquire more power over the lives of its citizens, more power in civil society. And that is something that has happened clearly. It was easily predicted back in February and March. And the other problem is that once the state acquires that kind of power, it's very difficult to push back. It's very difficult to then take back that power from the state. So this would be one of the struggles going forward as to how we can reasonably take back from the state the powers it accumulated during a time of crisis.
Great. We have 10 minutes, and I have one question. One more question. There are no more questions from the audience, and if there is no more, then this will be my final question.
Okay.
When you were talking about the relationship, the changing relationship between West and the East, when answering one of the questions of the capitalism and globalization, whether capitalism was transformed, I mean, the structure of the capitalism has been transformed in the 20 years, what came up to my mind is this fact. So when we look at the global distribution of wealth, what we basically see is that it's more equally distributed among the nations now. This means the West is not getting more anymore, it's getting less compared to 20, 30 years ago. So you have a more equal, I mean, you have equality in terms of, I mean, not just equality, but more equal in that sense. But what also happened is that the inequality is actually increased within the Western societies. So you see the shrinking of the middle classes and the top 1 percentile getting most of the wealth that the Western societies are generating. What I'm asking, I mean, this is the fact. So the non-Western societies is actually, I mean, they're actually catching up in a sense. Their middle classes are larger now. They get more from the global distribution of wealth. Consider Turkey, Brazil, India, and this and that. And they want, both individually and collectively maybe, more status, more voice, within the international order, if you call it liberal international order, whatever you can call, but they want more status in that order. And the question that I'm asking is, maybe the liberal international order, which you call as a fantasy, which you think of as a fantasy, but whatever it was, is collapsed. Maybe because its membership is now broader. I mean, it includes now the Eastern countries, ex-Soviet countries, socialist countries, it includes non-Western countries, and these countries, as well as, you know, like the post-socialist countries, they want more equality in that sense, to be equal. And maybe, I mean, going back to your earlier comment about being hopeful about the future, maybe we are really experiencing a crisis in this transition period, but this is a fact that we could be hopeful for the future.
Well, I think there are several things happening here. I mean, I mentioned early on about how so much of the Western model, for instance, is built upon successes and achievements that came at a time when the West had no rivals, when it had no challengers in the 19th century, when it was, you know, I mean, those countries of the West were really the sole imperialist powers. Yes, there was Spanish Empire and Portuguese Empire, but, you know, by the 19th century, they were in decline. So it was the Anglo-American empires and the French empires that were really prominent, and the Italians to a certain extent, and the Russians. Now, of course, once they lost their empires, and then, you know, many countries lost their empires after 1945. But then, because of the United States, which maintained a kind of informal empire and was able to, in a way, create what we call the liberal international order, with the help of, you know, various institutions and organizations that it was able to dominate because of its, you know, both its sort of military heft and its economic muscle. That kind of power was again going to be challenged the moment decolonization started to achieve its own, you know, kind of economic victory. That took a long time, by the way. You know, decolonization started in the 40s and 50s, and it took really, you know, the 2000s for it to become a really serious challenge to the West. And I think the challenger was a country that hadn't been formally occupied and colonized, but nevertheless, it had, you know, remained under the hegemony of the West for a long time, which was China. And I mean, you know, people knew and had been saying for a long time that once China awakens and becomes even a kind of moderately successful state, and you know, with its large population, with its resources, with its history, comes into its own, it's going to be a major challenger to the West. So, you know, the emergence of China is the biggest story of our times, and that, you know, flows straight from the process of loss of Western empires, the loss of Western hegemony, from decolonization. And going back to your question, I think you'll find that most of the changes that have happened in the non-Western world have happened actually in China. The biggest poverty reduction has happened in China. The biggest concentration of wealth that has been created, which now, you know, is enormous, has happened in China. Turkey, India, Indonesia, you know, Nigeria, they've had kind of roles to play in all of this. But I think the biggest benefits really of globalization have gone to China. And likewise, you know, now this is very well documented. They've gone mostly to a tiny minority in the West. One reason why people in the West are so angry, and one reason why Trump is in power, is because, you know, China has become so important. Jobs have gone to it, investment has gone to it, American money has gone to it, and left, you know, a lot of people in America very wealthy, shareholders rolling in money, but, you know, large numbers of people feeling like, oh, well, we've lost our sovereignty. What are we going to do now? And that's where Mr. Trump comes in and makes false promises to them. So in many ways, the political phenomena of our time cannot be explained without reference to what China is today or what China has achieved. They're very intimately connected. Now, is this process sustainable? Is China going to continue rising like this? Nobody knows. Really, nobody knows. I think it'd be foolish to say anything at this point. Is the process of middle-class consolidation in places like Turkey or India going to continue? Again, I don't think anybody knows. I think we are looking at a very partial result so far of, you know, what the investments and new policies adopted in the last few decades. You have a sizable middle class in India. You have a sizable middle class in Turkey. But when you actually start looking at economic fundamentals, you don't really see a very strong basis for sustained growth of that middle class over the next few decades. You don't even see, you know, a strong basis for sustained economic growth, let alone, you know, just the middle class. So I feel like, you know, I think we have actually, and with the pandemic, we've kind of moved into a different phase altogether, where all the, you know, promises and predictions made in the past, many of them are kind of, you know, defunct right now. I think until this whole thing plays itself out, and that may take many months, even years, we won't really know what actually, you know, is going to happen, or indeed what has happened in the last 2 to 3 years. I mean, you know, some things can be easily identified, and that we just mentioned, the kind of relative equalization has definitely happened. No question about that. But I think the larger gains have gone to China and to, you know, that minority in the West.
Great. So time is up, I guess. It's already 4. Although we lost 15 minutes, I think we can still stop now. No questions from the audience. As I can see, no more questions. It was a lively debate. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for being in Istanbul and sharing your thoughts with us. And I think that's pretty much it. And very sorry for the problems.
Not at all. No. Really great pleasure to be with you all and to have this opportunity to talk. Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry for the technical problems, by the way. But I think we managed it quite well.
Yeah, absolutely we did. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So I'm ending the session. I'm ending the webinar. Have a nice evening, everyone.
You too. Bye. Bye.